They laughed at the town midwife with no children, until the widowed rancher asked her. Whispers in the town. The bell over the general store door jingled as Eliza Hart stepped inside, her leather satchel brushing her hip. The September sun burned hot outside, but in here the wooden walls held a cool shade. A few heads turned as she entered, heads that always turned when she came in. She kept her gaze steady, though she could hear the whispers curling like smoke behind her back. Midwife with no babies of her own. Strange, ain't it? A woman can help birth half the town and still can't have one herself. Reckon God closed her womb for a reason. Eliza's jaw tightened, but her smile stayed fixed when Mr. Kellen, the storekeeper, greeted her kindly. Afternoon, Miss Hart. You here for supplies? Yes, flour, some dried herbs, and bandages if you've restocked. Her voice was even, practiced, like a doctor dictating notes rather than a woman absorbing the sting of every careless comment. She had delivered nearly every child in the valley, through storms, through long nights, through desperate prayers whispered over fading mothers. Her hands were steady, her knowledge deep. Yet all that respect was soured by one fact: she had never borne a child herself. It wasn't for lack of wanting. Once, long ago, she had dreamt of a family. But the years passed, suitors faded, and the empty cradle in her home gathered dust. She poured her love into other women's children, never letting the ache show in her eyes. Still, small towns remembered. And they whispered. Outside, the dirt road shimmered under the sun. Wagons rolled past, dogs barked, and somewhere a hammer rang against anvil. Eliza lifted her skirts carefully and walked toward the doctor's small clinic where she helped part-time. Halfway there, a group of young women standing outside the dress shop caught her attention. They were whispering and laughing. Eliza slowed, already knowing the subject of their amusement. Funny, isn't it? One girl said, loud enough for Eliza to hear. She knows everything about babies, but the good Lord never trusted her with one. Another smirked. Maybe no man would either. A ripple of giggles followed. Eliza's cheeks burned. She wanted to walk faster, but something in her, the same stubborn grit that had seen her through midnight births in freezing cabins, forced her to lift her chin instead. She passed them with quiet dignity, though her heart hammered. As she turned the corner, she nearly collided with a tall figure stepping out of the blacksmith's. Miss Hart, a deep voice rumbled. It was Daniel McCade, the widowed rancher. Daniel was a man carved from hardship. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, his hat shadowed sharp eyes that missed little. He had lost his wife 2 winters ago in childbirth, a tragedy that left him raising 3 small children alone. Folks respected him, some even feared his stern, quiet manner, but he bore his grief like a brand. Eliza steadied herself. Mr. McCade. Forgive me, I didn't see you. He gave her a slow nod, his gaze lingering. You walkin' too fast, or I'm in your way? Perhaps both, she answered, lips curving faintly. For a moment, silence stretched. The sounds of the town seemed to fade. His eyes searched hers, not unkind, but heavy with something unspoken. Then he said, I heard you brought Mrs. Tanner's baby through last night. They said it was near hopeless. Eliza exhaled softly. The babe was turned wrong, but we managed. Both are safe. A flicker passed across his features, something like relief, or maybe admiration. Then he glanced toward the women at the dress shop still giggling behind gloved hands. His jaw hardened. They've got too much time on their tongues, he muttered, voice low but edged. Don't pay it any mind. Eliza stiffened slightly. I never do. But she did. Every word cut like a thorn. Daniel studied her a moment longer, then touched the brim of his hat. Afternoon, Miss Hart. He stepped aside, letting her pass. She walked on, heart unsettled. He rarely spoke more than a few words, yet his defense, gruff as it was, lingered with her long after. That evening, in her small cottage on the edge of town, Eliza sat by the fire with her ledger open. She recorded births, noting weights, fevers, medicines given. Her handwriting was neat, precise. Each page bore testimony to her life's work, though none bore her own child's name. Outside, crickets sang. She closed the ledger and stared into the fire. Daniel McCade's face flickered in her memory, the stern kindness, the unspoken grief. She had delivered his youngest daughter, the one his wife hadn't lived to raise. She remembered his trembling hand clutching hers when the babe cried out, his eyes wet with both joy and sorrow. She had left that night with her heart aching for him, for the motherless children, for herself. And now, months later, fate seemed to keep drawing their paths together. The next day brought another summons, a rider pounding on her door before dawn. "Miss Hart, it's the McCade ranch. Little Anna's taken poorly. Won't stop crying." Eliza didn't hesitate. She gathered her satchel, mounted her mare, and rode hard across the waking plains. The sun spilled gold over the horizon as the ranch came into view, a broad stretch of land dotted with cattle, barns, and a weathered farmhouse standing proud against the endless sky. Daniel was waiting at the gate, worry etched deep into his rugged face. "She won't quiet," he said, lifting the small, flushed child into his arms. The fever took her sudden. Eliza placed a gentle hand on Anna's forehead, her practiced touch calming. "Let me see to her." Inside, she worked swiftly, cool cloths, soothing teas, whispered reassurances. The other two children hovered nearby, eyes wide with trust. Daniel watched too, his arms folded, helpless in the way men often were before illness. Hours later, Anna's fever broke. The little girl drifted into easy sleep, her chest rising steady. Daniel let out a long breath, as though he'd been holding it for days. He looked at Eliza then, not with pity, not with gossip in his eyes, but with something steadier, something weighted. "You've saved my family twice over now," he said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "I only did what anyone would." "Not anyone could," he corrected. Their gazes held. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass, carrying with it the faint promise of change. Eliza gathered her things, ready to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Hart." She turned. He hesitated, as though the words cost him effort. "If you'd stay a while, my children rest easier with you near." Her heart gave a sharp, unexpected twist. She should decline. Distance was safest, dignity her shield. But when she looked back at the sleeping child and the weary man standing guard, something in her softened. "Very well," she murmured. "I'll stay a little longer." And so she did, sitting by the hearth, telling gentle stories to the older children, her laughter mingling with theirs until the house, once shadowed by grief, seemed to breathe easier. Outside, the stars rose over the prairie. Inside, an unseen thread was quietly being woven between the midwife with no children and the widowed rancher who had lost more than most men could bear. The rancher's question. The McCade ranch grew familiar to Eliza in the weeks that followed Anna's illness. At first, Daniel had asked only for her help nursing the child back to strength. But once she began visiting, it seemed the children clung to her with a need she couldn't ignore. Little Anna would toddle after her, clutching Eliza's skirts with sticky fingers. Ben, the eldest at 10, shyly asked her to read from the worn family Bible each evening. And Mary, the middle child with her mother's curls, would slip her hand into Eliza's and whisper questions about things only a woman could answer, questions Daniel could never bear to. Eliza told herself it was temporary, that she was simply easing their way until Daniel found some permanent solution. But the truth she did not admit, even to herself, was that she treasured each moment. The house that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter whenever she visited. And Daniel, well, Daniel seemed to linger more often when she was near. One afternoon, she found him repairing a broken fence along the pasture. The sun was high, sweat streaking down his brow. He drove each nail with precision, muscles straining under his shirt. Eliza had come out to bring water, the children trailing behind her, and for a moment she stood watching him. He caught her gaze. Their eyes locked, and suddenly she felt her cheeks warm. She thrust the bucket forward too quickly. "Water," she said, a little breathless. He accepted it with a low thanks, drinking deeply before passing it back. For a moment his fingers brushed hers, rough against soft, and Eliza's heart skipped in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Fence won't hold long if I'm patchin' alone," he muttered. "But it'll do." "You've managed so much alone," she said softly. His jaw flexed. "Not by choice." There was a weight in his words that needed no explanation. He had buried a wife, shouldered a ranch, raised children in the shadow of loss. And now, standing under the wide sky, He seemed, if only for an instant, less like the untouchable rancher and more like a man laid bare. The town still whispered. Eliza heard them at church gatherings, at the mercantile, outside the schoolhouse. Strange sight, ain't it? The midwife, who couldn't have children herself, playing mother to McCade's brood. Mark my words, he'll never take her proper. He's too proud. She's gruppin' at a family that ain't hers. Each word was a barb, but she tried to let them fall away. Daniel never seemed to notice, or if he did, he never let it show. Instead, he continued to welcome her presence with a quiet steadiness that spoke louder than any rumor. One evening, after the children were tucked into bed, he walked her to her horse. The night was clear, stars scattered thick across the heavens. "Miss Hart," he said suddenly, stopping short of the gate. "Yes." His hat brim shadowed his face, but she could hear the strain in his voice. "I know what they say about you. About us." Her breath caught. She had never expected him to name it aloud. "They'll keep sayin' it too," he went on. "Doesn't matter much to me. But I wonder how much it weighs on you." Eliza stared at the ground, her throat tight. "Words are only words," she whispered. But in her chest, the ache throbbed, because words had power, and he knew it. Daniel studied her a long moment, then said quietly, "You've given my children more than any gossip can take away." Before she could reply, Mary's voice called from the window, and the moment slipped away. Weeks passed into months, autumn painting the plains gold and red. Eliza found herself spending more nights at the ranch than her own cottage, claiming the children needed her steady hand. She told herself it was duty, though her heart knew it was more. One night, Ben came to her with a question that stole her breath. "Miss Hart," he said shyly, "if you stay here always, does that mean you'll be like Mama?" Eliza's chest tightened. She smoothed his hair, forcing a gentle smile. "I'll always care for you, Ben. Always." But when she stepped outside later, she found Daniel leaning against the porch rail, listening. His eyes met hers, searching, unreadable. Something had shifted between them, something neither dared to name yet. It was in the dead of winter that the question finally came. A blizzard had swept across the plains, rattling shutters and burying fences in white. The McCade children huddled by the fire while Eliza stirred a pot of stew. Daniel came in from battling the storm, snow caked on his coat, his hands raw from hauling wood. He stood in the doorway, watching her ladle broth into bowls. His children crowded around her, safe, fed, loved. For the first time in 2 years, his house felt like a home. "Eliza," he said, his voice low. She turned, startled at the sound of her name without formality. "Yes, Daniel." He crossed the room, each step measured. When he stopped before her, she could see the storm not in his coat but in his eyes, a storm of fear, longing, and something fiercer. "I've asked much of you without asking proper," he said. "You've given my children a mother's care. You've given me back more peace than I thought I'd see again. But the truth is," he paused, breath catching, "I don't want you leavin' at night. I don't want you carryin' this burden half here, half gone." Her heart pounded. "Daniel!" He lifted a hand, rough fingers trembling slightly. "I'm askin you, not just to tend my children, not just to be neighborly. I'm askin you to be my wife." The room stilled. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity, their wide eyes flicking between them. Eliza's throat closed. The mocking voices of the town echoed in her memory, midwife with no children, never a mother, never a wife. She had carried that wound for so long she scarcely dared hope. And yet here was Daniel, offering her not pity but partnership. Not shame, but honor. Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered, "Are you certain? You've lost so much already. I could never take her place." Daniel's gaze softened, fierce and tender all at once. "I'm not askin you to replace her. I'm askin you to stand beside me. To be yourself. And that's more than enough." The children surged forward then, Mary throwing her arms around Eliza's waist, Ben grinning, little Anna squealing with joy. Eliza laughed through her tears, heart overflowing. She looked back at Daniel, saw the truth in his eyes, and finally allowed herself to believe. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling but sure. "Yes, Daniel, I'll be your wife." The wedding was small but filled with warmth. The church bells rang, and though some townsfolk still muttered, many more smiled. They saw the way Daniel's hand held hers, steady and proud, and the way the children clung to her skirts as though they'd always belonged there. The whispers faded. Respect replaced scorn. And Eliza Hart, the midwife mocked for having no children, walked down the aisle to a family of her own. As Daniel kissed her hand before all the town, she knew that love had woven her story into something greater than any cruel word. She had delivered countless lives into the world, but now, at last, she had been delivered into hers. And for the first time in her life, Eliza Hart did not feel empty. She felt whole.